Welcome back to the CMS-Connected show, the CMS industry's only news commentary show. I'm your host, Tyler Pyburn, along with Scott Liewehr from Digital Clarity Group, and we are coming back to you from the oldest ballpark in Major League Baseball, Fenway Park. Talk all you want about digital transformation. Meanwhile, at the end of the day, it takes good digital governance to get the job done right. Now, few organizations realize this because they're distracted by either internal politics or buried out in left field. Literally, that's where we're sitting right now, basically out in left field in the technology-first approach. Now, with that well-placed pun, haha, of course, let me introduce our special guest for today's show and author of Managing Chaos Digital Governance by Design, Lisa Welchman. Welcome back to the show, Lisa. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm doing very well.
Good.
Now, I have to ask you, before we really get into this, you're an Orioles fan. How do you feel about being here in Fenway?
To be honest with you, I feel a little dirty, but
Hey,
let's just go with it.
I love that dirty water. Boston, you're my home. That's the way the song goes. That's okay. All right, so Lisa, kind of delve into it. First off, talk about how organizations can reach the next level by kind of realigning people, content, technology, and improve governance. And the first question I kind of have for you is just talking about digital governance and why is it so important? Why is digital governance so important?
Well, when I think about digital governance and digital in general and digital transformation, digital governance is sort of the first cause of a good digital transformation. You can't really do anything holistically across the organization unless you've aligned all of your people. So what digital governance really focuses on is getting your digital team straightened out and sorted out so that they can do all those spectacular things that you want to do online. I think a lot of times organizations are trying to do things that are really quite sophisticated and involve collaboration across every single silo of the organization, but they have no idea who those people are, how they work together, and they're just not aligned around a common strategy. So digital governance really helps pull that all together, and then after that, you can sort of do whatever you want.
I mean, it's so funny. We constantly talk about this idea of digital transformation, and I sat with a group of CMOs last week who, by the way, I don't think are at the helm of digital transformation necessarily, but the biggest struggle that they all have is the culture issue, is the people issue, right? And so I think everybody recognizes that this is something. You mentioned, though, you talked about the digital team. How about the fact that transformation, though, permeates kind of throughout the entire organization? What's the kind of role of that digital team versus kind of trying to establish governance mechanism across, since it affects everyone,
Sure.
and we're becoming a more digital organization? The role of, can you talk about the role of the digital team versus kind of the rest, juxtaposed to the rest of the organization?
Sure, well there's two things about that really. One is that the digital team's actually much larger than people think. When everyone says digital team or web team or whatever it is inside of an organization, they're usually thinking about that central group of people that get in trouble if something goes wrong online, right? There's somebody that you can kind of point to that are the ones that get in trouble, and they can, wave the flag and say yay if something goes well, too. But the digital team is really quite extensive. It includes that central core of people that are sort of the enabling arm. They set the policies and the standards and the strategies. They set up web content management systems and all types of horizontal collaboration platforms and anything that's sort of like the underlying technical stack that supports digital. Content strategy, any of those things that really have to be comprehensive taxonomy, you can list them on and on. But then there's also another layer of the digital team, which is your distributed team. That aspect of the team are just sort of makers. They're people who are out in various business silos. They might be making mobile apps, managing content, authoring content, doing all sorts of things that usually make that central team really annoyed because they're the ones that might sort of go off the ranch and do their own thing, but they're also part of the team. Then you've got all these working groups that spin up around various standards groups or projects or any sorts of initiatives that might happen. You have groups that spin up around figuring out what the digital budget is. There's all these sorts of executive level to tactical level horizontal groups in the team. And then even beyond that, there's your extended team, which is really anyone outside of your organization that somehow enables digital. And so that could be a vendor who's implementing your content management system. It could be an interactive agency. Some people almost completely outsource production of their website to an extended team with a small core. So I think that's the thing that people don't understand. It's a huge team. And if you don't know who these people are, there's no way you can communicate to them.
Right.
And so that's really an important piece.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of good sense.
Now, with that mind, so given the place that we're at right now, let's talk about baseball in general. When we talk about like Major League Baseball, to me is a really interesting kind of case study right there, because you're dealing with 32 teams. You're dealing with all of their minor league teams and all of these teams that are continuing to publish content. Where do you start in something like that when an organization is so broad and so deep?
Well, that's really interesting, because when you use an analogy like Major League Baseball, it's actually a really quite interesting one, because there's that central hub of Major League Baseball, and there's certain rules and regulations that you have to follow if you're part of that entity. But then each team has their separate identity, and so that's not quite different than when an organization might have multiple brands. Like say you're a company, then you have different candy brands, or something like Hershey or something like that. You've got different candy bars that have different brands to them, so they're very different. So that's a very sophisticated type of governing mechanism and governing model, where you want to have some shared standards and some that are distributed or dispersed. And so you have to start by understanding what's shared and what's different, and that's really the key to governance. And then after that, you can kind of do what you want within that framework. And even more so, the team analogy is important, because I often use the wrong approach to digital governance as being one where you sort of go out on a field and with a bunch of your friends, and you look at each other and you say, let's play a game. And then you just start. That's sort of how people manage digital. No one says, what game is it? Right. What are the rules? And more importantly, who's playing what position? Mm-hmm. So it's really important to have all of that stuff defined before you start, because you can imagine, what would happen if, got out on the field and started playing baseball with no rules.
Just go ahead and
That's
play.
not the way the Orioles do it. They know what they're doing.
I feel like at some point I've got to bring in my Cubs fan. I'm a Cubby here, so both of you still feel bad for me right now, but that's all right. This is our year. You've actually said to me, related to that point, more than once, and I've repeated this as I often do, and I give you no credit for it whatsoever, that governance is actually freeing. I think you gave me an analogy that if, once you put up a fence around your yard, to be able to tell your kids you've got all this space is actually much more freeing and liberating than if they don't have any fence posts and you're kind of constantly watching them, that sort of a thing. Is that valid still here too in the same circumstances?
And it's freeing for everyone. It's freeing for the people who are making things, so those folks out in the distributed team that are actually putting things online, understand what the parameters are, but it's also really freeing for the organization, because they don't have to constantly monitor. Mm-hmm. Like once you put up the fence, which could be things like templates in a CMS, or anything else that actually processes that keep the standards in place and the policies in place. Once you've got that in place, you don't have to be checking all the time, right? So a lot of times that central digital team really wants to think that governance is about reviewing every single thing that goes online, but that doesn't have to be the case. It can be making sure that you have processes and policies and standards that are in place, so that when people are creating content and information, they're doing it in a standards compliant environment.
Can you just define quickly, because I'm not sure that all of us know. I know that you see big differences maybe between standards versus, can you define some of those for us a little bit?
The simple way is that policies are really organizationally focused. So you put a policy in place to protect the organization from things like litigation, or to help support the brand, but it's all about the organization, right? And making sure that you don't get sued, and making sure that when you're out there online, you look the way you're supposed to and to the best advantage. Sure. Standards are more about what you're making, right? So is what you're making of quality? Does it have a good information architecture? Is the user experience good? So the standard is focused more on the product that you're creating. And so that's the primary difference. There's usually fewer policies, and they change less frequently, and there's more standards, and they change more often because the technology around it's changing.
And is guidelines a third one, or is it just synonymous with standards?
No, guidelines are different than standards. Guidelines are really sort of like best practices. Okay. They're either, you want to make something a guideline either because there's really no way to check compliance with it, or because it's really difficult to check compliance with it. Things for content people, that's like voice and tone. So you might have a recommendation and say, we want to sound friendly, we want to be easy to understand, but how do you really check for that without looking at every single line?
Something like that's not even feasible, right? When we get to the scaling up
But
part.
you want to write some guidelines so that, and then you want to hire well, so that you've got guidelines and then people who do their job well, and then hopefully you'll get in the right direction.
So You brought up, Tyler, you brought up the analogy to baseball, which is fitting, of course, but I actually thought you were going in a little bit of a different direction. Where I'd like to ask you about this, Lisa, is digital transformation folks see so much as this undercurrent of data, which is now in such vast abundances within an organization. And given the Moneyball scenarios, where I thought you were going with the baseball thing, but how much it's changed given all of this access to data, folks. But there is still, when I've run groups, as I was in Austin last week, ran a group, and it was specifically talking about, well, the challenge they have is who owns the data, how do they align that data, where does it reside? Is it a similar problem to content? Do you see it as different? Is it the same solution from a governance standpoint when it comes to data, or no? What are your thoughts about that?
I'm stretching a little bit. I think there are some similarities, and I can maybe talk about them separately. The data piece is really interesting because honestly, when it comes to data and tangentially digital analytics as well, I just think organizations are quite immature. And it's mostly because they can't get their hands on it. Most people, so you don't even know where your digital team is. You know where your systems are, but there's no consistency about how the data is gathered, how it's aggregated.
Right,
it's
definitely
very hard, and the data being gathered was not architected as a system. So I think there's just a really, really long way to go with that piece. And I think people can do sort of backwards analytics and look at data sets and claim to have some conclusions about things. But I think it's going to be, another good 10 years before we really start sort of doing that, because you need to engineer for that data.
I would imagine that's a near-term frontier for digital governance, has got to be getting your arms around that, or helping organizations to kind of tackle that problem.
Sure, but you need to get the people straight first, because they're the ones that are putting the
There's
systems together.
and hoarding and just alignment that's required.
Doesn't matter.
And a strategic objective. There's a plethora of data out there that you can actually gather and look at. But what's important to gather and look at, right? You have to know what that is. On the other hand, content's been around forever. And there's a lot of content online that used to exist in a print format that's been put on in PDFs. It's just there's unstructured content, structured content, content that's almost data because it's so particular. And so that's a really interesting component of it. And I think what's interesting about that for me is you have people who treat content as a narrative text, and then people who create content as data. And I think those two arms really need to move together. And you think about that a lot in the content marketing space of just how do you push these things together and actually get to action that. And you have two different types of players on the team who are working with that. There are people who want to look at data and people who look at content as storytelling. And so if we can pull those two pieces together and get them to understand that there's an alliance, right, and that it's not a competition, then I think we'll be working well.
I'm with you.
Let's talk about content ROT actually, and how does better governance actually support the elimination of content ROT?
So ROT, redundant, outdated, trivial content, we've all seen it before, we've all run into it online. And I think the single one thing that good digital governance helps you do is it takes you towards content governance, which is really sort of a subset of any type of corporate governance, which lies around actually the care and feeding of actual content and the team around the content. And so when you've got a lot of rot, it usually means that you're not clear who's on your content team, what they do, and who's supposed to actually manage the full life cycle of the content. So historically, we just dumped a lot of content online, and so up until maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I'll give everybody a pass, right? Everybody was just dumping stuff online and putting, okay, we all did the bad stuff, but now you shouldn't be doing that anymore. When you're putting something online, you should understand when it needs to be edited and when it needs to be removed, and then beyond that, when you start thinking about, digital records retention and document retention standards inside your organization, when is it okay to actually destroy that content inside the organization? So there's this full life cycle around that, and if we understand that aspect of it and are managing it, then you will not have redundant, outdated, and trivial content, or you won't have outdated and trivial content. Redundancy actually comes out of the silos, right, where you have different aspects of the same business doing the same thing over and over again because they're disjointed. And when that's happening, that usually means that you have a weak core team. That number one team in the middle that writes all the strategies, policies, and standards and implements those enabling technologies, it means they're not doing their job of sort of overseeing everything and making sure that there isn't redundancy. They're not doing that particularly well, or there's not a particularly unified content strategy.
Is this more though about fending off a risk or leveraging an opportunity? Like, if I had redundant, like what's the downside of having this rot, or what's the upside of not having rot? Like, why is this so relevant?
Well, it's relevant because it messes up search.
I was going to say the redundancy. I mean, you're just shooting yourself in the foot right off the get-go.
Yeah, I mean, and people are guessing. I remember many years ago I worked with a client in the federal government space, and part of the case that we had for selling at that time just web governance project was redundant content or duplicative content that said slightly different things. So it was in a highly regulated environment, and it was difficult to know what's right and what's wrong. So I think just off the bat, it's just confusing, and doesn't provide a clean and good user experience.
Sure, excellent.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. The search thing, I've gone through that with organizations, and it's just an absolute nightmare because you wonder, why am I ranking slipping consistently? And always, then you go back and look, well,
I know inside an organization for certain things like, I remember even when I was working inside an organization, SharePoint was the death of us, right? Because, and it's not SharePoint's fault, it's just, it became a glorified file share. And now suddenly people felt liberated, and it is. People felt liberated to just like, oh, I'll keep this local for us. And so they'd pull down a policy because it might have been more difficult to find. And finally somebody got their hands on it, so they shared it with their team. And then now that team only looked to that one. Meanwhile, the policy's been updated 10 times and nobody knows that they've got their local version here, that nobody's paying attention to what's going on. So I certainly understand inside an organization how challenging that is.
It takes an incredible amount of discipline, like playing a sport, an incredible amount of discipline to actually manage that much content. And I think people are just waking up to that. Right? It's sort of like, anybody can play baseball, but not everybody can play it well. Right? So anybody can put up a website, but not everybody's going to do it well. So there's a certain amount of rigor that's involved in getting good at that. And I think organizations just now, and as the antecedent to really being able to start a digital transformation, have to learn how to do that.
And I think, to make the data content parallel again, there's a real danger. I think we're in this notion of, so data, I think one of the dangers of data is that people have this mindset around big data now. It used to be capture only what you need, how are you going to use it eventually, and then you're going to make sure it's not garbage in, garbage out. Big data idea says capture everything, we'll figure it out later because the tools are going to be so powerful that we'll be able to make sense of it all. Meanwhile, we're making these big gigantic landfills of data that are very difficult to deal with. Content, however, I don't think anybody thinks that big content is a good idea, that we're going to be able to make sense of it. I think they've just fallen into the trap, but I don't think anybody, like with data, they're going there intentionally. Like blindly, but thinking that's going to be an okay thing. But I don't think anybody believes that there's tools and things out there to go make sense of big content where it wouldn't be harmful, right? And this helps you avoid the idea of big content.
Yeah,
I don't know. It wasn't a question.
I could disagree with you. I was about to say, I could disagree.
Go ahead.
I think there's a use case for big content. It's just not in a business.
Okay.
Right? So there might be in academia. There's all kinds of reasons where you might actually want that big content set. Things like the Wayback Machine online. That's just going out and aggregating stuff and aggregating it. But that's more of a historical research focused thing. Most organizations aren't those types of organizations, except maybe higher ed. So a for-profit business or even a non-profit that's very mission driven, they're probably not going to want big content. They're going to specifically want their content. But I can imagine wanting to leverage that in some use cases.
By the way, I don't think big content is a term.
I was going to say, I think you just coined big content.
I think we just coined big content. I don't know if it's a good thing or not. But
check that
is
off.
It a term? I don't know. Do you know it?
Nope.
I don't know. Maybe.
Coined right here, CMS-Connected, folks. All right, we got one more. I got one more question for you, Lisa. Talk about governance inside an organization. Where do content governance fit in with things like digital governance and IT governance? Because like you started talking about right there, it is separate in a sense.
It is. I mean, content governance is a very, very specific thing. When you look at sort of the digital umbrella, well, let's start at the top. You look at corporate governance, you have fiscal governance. Forever we've had IT governance, right? So slotting into that now for me is digital governance, right? You have this online experience, it has to be governed. You have to make sure you're not doing things that are illegal. You have to make sure that you're doing a good and quality job and you understand who's touching what and where. What's really interesting about content governance is content governance you could think of as a subset of digital governance if you were only thinking about digital content. But for organizations, there's also omni-channel, right? So that sort of cuts horizontally across the organization. And it's a very, very interesting use case and complex use case, because when you think about someone's user journey through content, there's an online aspect and an offline aspect. There might be a face-to-face aspect, and it sort of weaves through that. And so understanding what that is and actually understanding the full team that supports that and the life cycle for all that information, and also understanding whether it should be online, offline, face-to-face, or some combination of both. Should it be on a mobile app? Should it be on a website? That's the world of the content governance person. And I think it's a really special world, an important world, and it's going to have to align with the data people and everything else, as well as people who are traditionally in that digital space working on standards for enabling publishing platforms and things like that. So it's a real special area.
So quickly with your book then, just give a quick plug to that and tell us about kind of is this become the reference manual for how to deal with this? Talk about how do you address this sort of stuff in the book then?
So Managing Chaos, Digital Governance by Design, it's been out for about a year. Real excited about that. Took me a long time to write it. I think it's been really well received. The way I really see that book is a first attempt to actually define the space. When we talk about digital governance and governing digital, what's language that we use and ways that we can describe the problem? Because usually when I work with people, I come in and they usually say something like, so-and-so over there is a jerk, or they won't comply with my standards, or they're just like, they're fighting about all kinds of things, and they're talking about it at a project level. Like, this project is hard, I can't implement my CMS because these people, IT picked the wrong one, or all these other sorts of debates. And that's really interesting, but the reality is they have a governance problem, which is they didn't use the right methodology for setting the standard for the CMS. Maybe it wasn't as inclusive of a group. And so I'm trying to push people from getting away from that sort of combative language and more into understanding you have a problem with your digital team structure, and you're probably not clear about who sets strategy, policies, and standards. And if you just stop and have a conversation about this, these other types of things like product selections won't be so difficult, because you'll understand who needs to be in the room when that selection is made, and that can actually streamline everything. And so that's my hope for it. I really hope that the dialogue is going to broaden, and it has. Some of the big analyst firms are talking about that as Digital Clarity Group is one of them, are discussing digital governance. So I hope it's an opening play to actually have a richer conversation about it and to mature the space.
And talking about discussion, where can folks have more discussion with you? Where do you actually want to be found?
You can find me at lisawelchman.com. That's the easiest way to find me. And I'm always around giving talks all the time.
Yeah, very
Lisa,
good.
love it. Thank you so much for taking time out today. Really
Thanks for
appreciate
having me.
Thank you. For
Always
coming
a
on.
pleasure. Definitely. She is Lisa Welchman. We'll be right back. We'll be talking with Amy Martin in just a few seconds right here on CMS Connected.
Your job is to cut through the noise. To succeed, you need to reach out to your target audiences in real time with messages that speak to them. You can't let technology get in the way of your brand. That's the spirit. First Spirit is a powerful solution that helps you effectively communicate and engage with your target audience. Get an awesome ROI. Success in the market means your message got through to the right people at the right time in the right way. And that's why you need First Spirit. Get started with digital marketing. Visit www.espirit.com now.